Welcome, everyone, to the latest in our series of conversations about important new books here at spiritualityandpractice.com. We are here today with Amanda Tyler, whose book was published 9 days ago. Amanda, I will apologize right at the beginning because your publicist hasn't yet sent me the finished book, so I'm holding up the galley. But anyway, this is it. We reviewed it on publication day 9 days ago, How to End Christian Nationalism. And let me introduce you all to Amanda. Amanda Tyler is an attorney, executive director of Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, which we will probably end up referring to as BJC. She's the lead organizer of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. She holds degrees from Georgetown and the University of Texas School of Law. She's a member of the Texas and U.S. Supreme Court Bar. She has testified before Congress, and her work has been featured by or published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS News, ABC News, CNN, and MSNBC. She lives in Texas, spends a lot of time in Washington, D.C., and you may have seen her a few days ago on MSNBC talking about this book, How to End Christian Nationalism. So welcome, Amanda. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, John, and thanks to all of you for joining the conversation.
This is an important conversation. You know, you and your publisher knew what you were doing by the timing of this book, of course. You know, we probably needed it a few years ago, but at least we have it a couple of weeks before this big election. But let me say that I'd like to step back from the election first, if you don't mind. It would be easy to jump right into that, which is the anxiety on everyone's minds and hearts. But can we start by you giving us, just make us your students for a minute and teach us about where Christian nationalism came from, sort of historically, when was it first seen, experienced, and give us a little bit of that deeper background.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great place to begin. So I want to first give a definition of religious nationalism, which is even a larger overarching ideology. And I define that simply as a fusion of national and religious identities. And religious nationalism has been a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today. So I'm going to start large and kind of zero in. So then just Christian nationalism is a fusion then of Christian and national identities. And I would point to the first example of Christian nationalism dating all the way back to Constantine, the first time that the emperor took on the Christian religion as an official religion and used the power of that empire, including violent force, to enforce Christianity on other people. It creates in-groups and out-groups. This kind of religious nationalism is really all about power. So then in the American context, American Christian nationalism then is a fusion of American and Christian identities. And it suggests that to be a real American, that one has to be a Christian. And not just any kind of Christian, but a Christian often who holds fundamentalist religious beliefs that are in line with certain conservative political priorities. And also in the American context, Christian nationalism relies very heavily on this mythological founding of the United States as a quote unquote Christian nation. Not Christian nation in a demographic or majority sense, because that has certainly been true from census data and from other public polling. A majority of American citizens have always identified as Christian, but rather this narrative of America as a Christian nation suggests that America was founded by Christians in order to privilege Christianity in law and policy. It carries with it this idea that God's providential hand has been guiding America throughout history and into the present day. Some aspects even suggest that the founding documents themselves were divinely inspired. And this narrative, this mythology of America as a Christian nation is problematic on many fronts. On one front, it's really problematic theologically for Christians because it suggests that God loves America best, that God has a special plan for America in ways that really violate a gospel that tells us that God loves the world, that God doesn't distinguish between nationalities, that God's love is for everyone, regardless of national power. But it also is problematic for our pluralistic democracy, because it kind of undercuts and attacks that foundational promise that one's belonging in America never should depend on how one worships or what one believes. And also because of this kind of founding narrative, this mythology, it also kind of incorporates this idea of white supremacy from the beginning, because it creates and perpetuates a sense of who really belongs in this country that's limited to the people who held full citizenship rights at the founding, which were a very small group of people, white Protestant Christian men who owned property. Those were the people who were considered real full Americans at the beginning. And Christian nationalism continues to suggest in a lot of different ways, some very subtle, that those are the people who fully count now as well.
Well, and those white Christian men are what we saw at Charlottesville, which was what, 7 years ago now.
That's
And
right.
many of us, I mean, I think I'm remembering correctly for myself, I don't think I paid any attention to something called Christian nationalism until Charlottesville. I mean,
Yeah.
is that because I wasn't paying attention, or did something begin to take place at around that time?
Well, I think around that time, and I'd even push it the window back a little bit farther to 2015, with the shooting at Mother Emanuel AME Church. There was this rising violence, white supremacist violence, but that was informed and I think intensified by this idea of Christian nationalism, that there was some ethno-national identity that was labeled Christian, that was really the defining point of what it means to be an American, and that anyone who falls outside of that narrow circle of belonging doesn't fully belong here. I think that as a term, Christian nationalism is something that has been more recently in use, and certainly over the last 7 years. In looking at this, I think there were some books written about Christian nationalism, for instance, from Michelle Goldberg, who writes for the New York Times. She wrote a book before that time, but it really has taken off. I'll say through my work at BJC, I was at least familiar with the mythology of America as a Christian nation and how that was being pushed to undercut our understanding of separation of church and state, our understanding of how religious freedom is protected in this country by not establishing religion and by leaving free exercise to religious institutions. So the Christian narrative myth, I think, was being talked about for several decades, but Christian nationalism as an idea is something I think we're only recently really being able to name and place.
Now, BJC, as you just referred to it, is the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, the organization that you're the executive director of. And the first word there is Baptist, and you are Baptist, and you live in Texas.
I do.
So, as a Baptist who lives in Texas, one might think that you have more insight into white Christian nationalists than, some of the rest of us who live in, bluer states, or come from religious traditions or no traditions at all, that don't have associations with conservatives as conveniently or easily as the Baptist denominations do. Has that been part of your immersion into this sort of crisis that we're in the middle of, that you sort of know it from the inside out?
Yeah, I do think that I'm very familiar with Christian nationalism in the culture. And I want to think about Christian nationalism as we talk about it. I defined it very broadly as an ideology and a framework that tries to merge American and Christian identities. And I do that very intentionally because I think it's important that we think about both some of the more stark, dangerous, violent aspects of Christian nationalism, which we've already named, and some of the more mundane, everyday examples of Christian nationalism. Things that show up more like Christian supremacy in a culture, Christian primacy, Christian privilege. And certainly growing up, I live in Dallas now. I grew up in Austin. I've gone to Baptist churches all my life. I recognize and see that sense of cultural primacy that Christianity is given, and certain more conservative forms, including from a Baptist perspective. Now, a quick word about being Baptist. It's a very broad group of people, lots of different ways to be Baptist, some of them very fundamentalist, some of them much less so. I do not come from a fundamentalist strand of Baptist Christianity, but there is a lot of fundamentalism certainly in Texas. Another word about just kind of the prevalence of Christian nationalism across the country. This is something that is found in every community, in every religious group, every state, every ethnicity, every racial group, to different degrees. And while it is definitely true that there are more people who embrace Christian nationalism who are white evangelicals than people, for instance, who are Black evangelicals, or people who are Latino Christians, or any other kind of like aspect that we want to think about it, or even people who are white Jews, right? There are some people in every group do embrace it, but the highest rates are in some of these more conservative religious spaces. And also even in Texas, when we look at like recent numbers, about 37% of Texans are either accommodating or embracing Christian nationalism. But that means that the vast majority of Texans aren't, right? That 63% of us are actually resisting or rejecting it. And so I think that I just wanted to kind of offer a little bit of current data for us to kind of get a better sense of what this is all about. But I guess to get back to your original question, I do think that my geographic and my religious location have given me access to understand Christian nationalism, but have also given me the tools to resist and reject it.
I would think it would also lead to you having a stronger voice, because you are in the heart of where some of this is taking place more commonly. I mean, if
Yeah.
you were an attorney living in Vermont, you might not have quite as much of a voice as, an attorney and someone with your background living in the heart of Texas.
Yeah, and I think, another piece about being Baptist is a long time, centuries long for the Baptist movement commitment to religious freedom and separation of church and state. That's been lost and forgotten in some Baptist circles today, but it's the legacy that I try to carry on, that the people who work with me at Baptist Joint Committee try to carry on, and as do, a large group of individuals and churches. But I do think that it is more difficult for people to dismiss our objections when we're coming at it from, inside Baptist churches, inside the state of Texas. And we're able to speak to this not just as patriotic Americans, but also as faithful Christians who care about our religious freedom as much as we care about the religious freedom of our neighbors who practice different faiths or no faith at all.
Yeah, thank you. Let me remind people that I'm Jon Sweeney with Spirituality and Practice, and we're here talking with Amanda Tyler, who's the author of How to End Christian Nationalism, which was just published 9 days ago. And Amanda's been spending a lot of time talking about it for obvious reasons, because the book's published at a very important time in our history. So Amanda, I'm curious, you are a member of the Texas and U.S. Supreme Court bars. I'm curious if Christian nationalism has been part of any litigation. I mean, does the phrase come up ever, for instance, in a Supreme Court decision, for instance?
I am not recalling the phrase itself being used in Supreme Court decisions, but some of the ideas of Christian nationalism have certainly been repeated. Some of the mythology of America as a Christian nation by justices writing in both majority and dissenting or concurring opinions, who themselves repeat some of the mythology, as well as justices who reject the mythology and reject the interpretation of history that doesn't comport with a fulsome reading of religious freedom for all. And I think just even looking back over the last few years of Supreme Court cases in the area of church-state separation or First Amendment law can show a deep divide among the justices on the court, but also some really confusing opinions that have come out from the court about how we best protect religious freedom. Part of my work is I co-host a podcast called Respecting Religion, where my co-host and I really do analyze the state of church-state law, some of the new cases that are coming out, some of the older cases and what their modern implications are. And I think in particular, and where I'm really watching as we see what's happening with the court going forward, there's this newfound fascination by the majority, conservative majority on the court in history as the ultimate test of what is or is not constitutional. We certainly saw that in the Dobbs case that overturned Roe. We've seen it in some Second Amendment cases and how they interpret what the Second Amendment means. And we've also seen it in First Amendment religion cases, a case a couple of years ago that came out of the state of Washington that sometimes was called the football coach prayer case, a case about a football coach in the state of Washington who had a particular religious practice of praying at the 50-yard line immediately after football games. The problem with this being not that he had a private prayer practice, but that the way that he practiced it, necessarily involved the involvement of his high school football players in ways that did not lead to religious freedom, that led to government sponsorship or government endorsement of religion in ways that are at odds with our tradition. And the Supreme Court majority in that case both affirmed his constitutional right to carry out that prayer practice, but in so doing, really upended the way that we've considered what is an establishment of religion in this country by saying, we're just going to look to history and practice. And the problem with this, of course, is history is in the eye of the beholder. There are all kinds of stories that we can tell from history. And if we're going to be going back to this more cherry-picked version of American history that really relies on the religious biographies of the founders, I think we're going to start to see a lot more Christian nationalism seep into the ways that courts are considering what is or is not an establishment of religion in ways that can be very troubling. Another case, and I do write about this in the book, from several years ago, was a case that said that prayers before town council meetings, city council meetings, would be considered constitutional. You could have a sectarian prayer. And this is an example, and I quote in the book from Justice Elena Kagan's dissent in this case, about how, and again, I don't think she used the words Christian nationalism, but she was really talking about it, how the impact of this kind of policy in local government sends a message that you don't belong in this community if you don't affirm or believe the sectarian prayers that are said before the meeting. That it does merge American and Christian identities in ways that are harmful to religious freedom. And so I use that example in the book as a way that people can work to end Christian nationalism in their communities by saying, just because we can say a prayer before our city council doesn't mean that we should. What are ways that we can send a more inclusive message to our community? And the recommendation I have in the book is, how about a moment of silence? How about a moment of centering that everyone can then do with what they want to do that doesn't send this overt signal that the government is somehow endorsing or placing above other religions, Christianity in that context.
Now, do Christian nationalists use the phrase themselves? Do they own the phrase? Are they proud of that moniker?
Well, it depends on who you're talking to. And I'll say, and this is a slight, but I think important distinction. I don't actually label people as Christian nationalists because I don't see it as an immutable characteristic. Instead, I kind of follow the ways that social scientists talk about it. Think about it as an ideology that we're either embracing or rejecting. So I'll talk about people as ambassadors of Christian nationalism. And that gives more space for people to change their mind. And I think it also gives space for all of us to be a little more self-reflective about ways that we at times can embrace Christian nationalism. I can make an action that embraces Christian nationalism, but that doesn't turn me into a Christian nationalist.
Well,
I can make a different choice next
actually,
time.
give me an example of that. I mean, what would be? I mean, I'm a pretty blue progressive myself with
Yeah.
Christian background. So, what would be a way that I exhibit Christian nationalism and may not even realize it?
Yeah, so one way would be thinking that, for instance, it's important that the laws reflect your Christian values. You know, like I am, you know, if I am saying, you know, I think because majority of Americans are Christians, I think that our laws should reflect Christian values. That's a sign of embracing Christian nationalism. And not the idea, because now, are there some Christian values that are universalized, that are not specific to Christianity, but that we can think of are good rules to live by? Absolutely. That's a subtle like shift in thinking, but it's different than saying, I think that my particular view on how to order society that is based on my religion and that is more unique to my religion, that needs to be imposed on everyone else. Another example can be as simple as, you know, the presence of an American flag in a sanctuary. That is something that happens in a lot of sanctuaries. And again, it's this merger of American and Christian identities in a very symbolic way by having a patriotic symbol in a religious space, but that can send a confusing message, very subliminal, about what exactly are we worshiping in this space? How is this kind of impacting us? I mean, I would say very everyday example, but we're in political season. It seems like every single speech by every candidate has to end with God bless America. That is an everyday example of civil religion and of inserting this merger of American and Christian identities in ways that I think most of the time we don't even hear anymore. But what would be the outcry if a presidential candidate stopped saying that? And what does that say about us, that we somehow would be offended or upset if that were the case? And so I think there are just lots of ways that this is just in the water, in the language of what we're talking about, and that gives us a little more space. But your question was, do people who embrace Christian nationalism, do they call it that themselves? Do they recognize it? Do they champion it? I think it depends on the person. I mean, I'll give a very prominent example of Marjorie Taylor Greene, this pretty extreme member of Congress who a couple of years ago made headlines when she said, I'll say it, I think I'm a proud Christian nationalist. She even started selling T-shirts that said proud Christian nationalist. So the people who bought and wear her T-shirts, I think they're wearing a label, they're wanting to associate with it. I think that's a pretty distinct minority position in the country, the people who actually claim the label. I think they do it in more subtle ways, sometimes by saying, well, yeah, America's a Christian nation. Yeah, I think that our values are Judeo-Christian values. And you can kind of hear it in saying, yeah, other people from other faiths can live here, but these are the values that our country is based on. Those are the kinds of messages I think that people who most strongly embrace Christian nationalism associate with, even if they're not claiming that as an ideology or as a label itself. I just driving, home from picking my son up from school the other day, I saw a flag on a flagpole that was outside someone's house that was an American flag with, looked like an American flag, the stripes, but in the corner where the stars would be was a cross, right? And so this was just a very visual, this was like saying, to me, it was this is a house of Christian nationalism if you're going to hang that flag outside your house. So I think there's a small group of people probably who do like thoroughly merge their Christianity and their patriotism in ways that look a lot more like Christian nationalism than not.
I'm Jon Sweeney. I'm here talking with Amanda Tyler, who's the author of How to End Christian Nationalism. In about, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes, I'm going to look to the chat to see if any of you have questions that you want me to pose to Amanda. So go ahead and type those in if you have them. Amanda, this leads now to a question I wanted to ask, and I'm sure you know I wanted to ask. We reviewed your book effusively, you know, when it was published. But the one thing I said that I'm looking forward to asking Amanda Tyler when I interview her is, why didn't you title it How to End White Christian Nationalism? I mean, there's no epidemic of Black Christian nationalism, is there? I mean, we're talking about a white problem, aren't we?
Yes and no. So, and this is actually why I didn't call it How to End White Christian Nationalism. So I do talk throughout the book about how white supremacy is baked into the concept of American Christian nationalism. And I kind of tell the story about how just the history of the country makes that so. How the Christian is more about an ethno-national identity of whiteness. The Christian of Christian nationalism is this identity of whiteness and not a given religion or theology. And I do, when I'm making presentations and even when I'm writing, I sometimes use Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism somewhat interchangeably. The reason I prefer using Christian nationalism and why I put it on the title of the book is because people from other, I think calling it just white Christian nationalism suggests that you have to be white to embrace white Christian nationalism. And that's just not the case. There are actually growing numbers of people, particularly in the Black and Latino communities, who are embracing Christian nationalism. I'm hearing from a number of people that a large number of more recent immigrant churches tend to embrace Christian nationalism in higher numbers than one might expect. And I think there are some complicated reasons behind this. I was in a different interview this week, and someone asked me, the interviewer who was Black asked me, you know, I'm often having to explain to people, how is it that Black people can endorse Christian nationalism? He asked me, how is it that a woman can endorse Christian nationalism? And so much about this is so patriarchal in nature and anti-woman in nature. And it was a really thoughtful question. I answered it this way. I said, look, you know, I think that part of just living in American society is patriarchal. Part of living in American society is white supremacist and racist. And so if we live here, we are just absorbing these messages and these ideologies all the time, regardless of what our own identity markers may be. Also, the thing that is so pernicious about Christian nationalism, one of them, it really creates an effective caste system in this country. The people at the top, the people in that tightest circle of belonging, they have the most rights, they have the most privileges, and everyone else, to some degree, is from a lower caste, is a second-class citizen, effectively, in the way that Christian nationalism operates. But the Christian part of Christian nationalism, if you can claim that Christian identity in some way and buy into this ideology, then you get some aspect of belonging in this stratified and status in this stratified system. And so this is what's so harmful, is the very ideology that is excluding so many people. Some of those who are excluded for some reason want to be included, and therefore can be kind of sucked into this ideology in ways that give them some pathway of belonging or status in what is a very inequitable system. So that's my long response to kind of explain why I prefer the term Christian nationalism. I want to talk about racism. I want to talk about white supremacy. I want to talk, as I do throughout the book, about how really white Christians need to do the most and have the most responsibility in doing something about this problem. But I don't want to send a false message that you have to be white or that you have to be Christian to embrace Christian nationalism.
Interesting. I mean, in my conversations I've had about this in recent months and years, I guess I've always wanted to call it white Christian nationalism because I've wanted to own it, that it's guys who look like me that do this. I mean, Charlottesville were guys who look like me. I mean, there were not black faces there. There were not Asian faces. There were, but I hear what you're saying. I mean, your answer to my question is almost a little depressing. I mean, so I mean, let's talk for a minute about where this is going. I mean, I like what you said earlier, that it's not an immutable condition, I think is the way you put it. I'm glad. And of course, you're right. I'm sure it's not. There's no reason to label and demonize, and that person is now lost because they're a Christian nationalist or something. But it is pervasive. Is it growing? Are we at the tipping point right now? Is Tuesday's election the tipping point? I mean, give us a little sense of where we are and where it's moving.
Yeah. So I think what's helped me to kind of think about this is to think about Christian nationalism, which is the biggest focus of my book, as this ideology and cultural framework. One that a majority of Americans are at least now resisting or rejecting, as opposed to accommodating and endorsing accommodating, endorsing. So that's like the good news, right? And I think if we and the trends over that polls have been done, research has been done, has actually been an encouraging sign that now that we've named it and have a way to measure it, it actually does seem to be reducing in American society. The discouraging part, and the part that I do think makes this such an urgent threat, is that Christian nationalism is also a well-funded and highly organized political movement. It's a movement that's been gaining force over the last 50 years, that's been at work and really in a very patient and methodical way has been taking over various aspects of political power, but at the national level, but also at the state and local level. And so take my state of Texas, for instance. I said earlier that, according to recent polling, about 37% of Texans are kind of either embracing or accommodating Christian nationalism. I was frankly very surprised that the number was that low when I saw that. That's just over the national average. If you look at the policies coming out of the Texas legislature, if you look at what's happening in some local school boards and different areas of the state, much more extreme policies that look completely driven by Christian nationalism in those areas. And what accounts for that is, very well-funded interests that are driven by Christian nationalism that have essentially bought a Texas legislature, decades of political gerrymandering that have made the Texas House and Texas Senate less competitive seats, which means that the more extreme candidates get elected, and then a real concerted effort at the local level on school boards to really take over local government in different places. The impact of that, you were asking about a tipping point. I think in Texas, in many ways, we're past a tipping point towards authoritarianism and the way that the policies are being driven. We saw that even with a corrupt corrupt attorney general that could not be removed from office and then exacted political retribution on the members of the House that voted to remove him last year. So we're in that state, and that's true in Texas. I think that's true in other areas of the country. Florida comes to mind at a place that's passed really authoritarian measures in recent years. And depending on what happens with the presidential election, I do think that we could head over the edge into that authoritarian territory on the national level as well. So all of that is deeply concerning, which gets me back to the book, and how to end Christian nationalism is really about more and more of us who are resisting and rejecting it, taking a more active role in our democracy, being able to name and talk about Christian nationalism when it hits close to home, but also organizing for change in our communities and advocating from our values against Christian nationalism and for the creation of a beloved community wherever we live. And I do find, and I'm seeing signs of that kind of work happening here in Texas, where there is a resistance to what's happening, that these policies aren't, even if they're passed, they're not necessarily being implemented because there is pushback from people on the ground. And I think a similar thing, if we do head closer and closer to authoritarianism in other parts of the country or even nationwide, I think that I think it is both possible but also necessary that there be a national resistance and that people of faith be actively involved in that resistance effort.
Thank you. Yes, you organize your book. You call them steps 1 through 8 of how to do what your title is, how to end Christian nationalism. And you've just sort of quickly mentioned a few of them. Can you mention maybe another couple of them? And can you give us an example? What is a way in which you've seen one of these steps being acted out on a local level to create more of that beloved community that you refer to?
Yeah. Well, I think one step I did not mention, but I think is absolutely necessary for Christians who read this book and for Christians who do the work is to really be grounded in our understanding of the gospel and be able to distinguish Christian nationalism from Christianity, to point out how it's a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus, to reject this narrowing and this exclusionary and often violent interpretation of Christianity that's being pushed by Christian nationalism, and to be forceful in calling that out in our public spaces. I think part of the problem of the movement of Christian nationalism is this one very narrow slice of the entire Christian movement is claiming to act and speak on behalf of all Christians. And so it's really important that we ground ourselves in our own Christian identity, our own understanding, interpretation of the gospel in order to push back. Doesn't mean we have the only voice. And in fact, people of all faiths and none have a role to play in this larger movement. But that particular chapter, I'm really writing very specifically to Christians and encouraging them through conversation, through study, to develop the language that they would use to talk about and to understand how this is a departure from their calling as Christians. But then to kind of explain how this has played out, on the ground, I will give you a very current example. So in the state of Texas, there is currently a proposal to change the reading and language arts curriculum in Texas public elementary schools. So how we teach kids to read from kindergarten through 5th grade, and to change the instructional materials to include the teaching of Bible stories in the curriculum. This was a curriculum that we understand was written in part by the very conservative Hillsdale College, who came in and helped the state of Texas write these new instructional materials. They were on a fast track to approval through the State Board of Education, but we've been doing some local organizing here in Texas, and we got people together, people of faith, to actually read the materials, to understand how these were violating our religious freedom as Christians, but also the religious freedom of our neighbors from different faith traditions, and then to work with all of these people, all multi-faith, multi-ethnic, multiracial coalition coming together to both file comments to the State Board of Education and then to actually go testify before the State Board of Education in September. And when we did these things, we were outnumbering those of us who had concerns about the instructional materials. We're outnumbering those who were in favor of them in written comments by 10 to 1, and people who actually showed up at the meeting by at least 3 or 4 to 1. And in ways that we don't know the outcome of this advocacy yet, but in ways that we can tell have already both slowed down the process, made modest, I don't think enough, but at least made modest changes to the proposals. And we will see, but maybe even lead to a defeat of the proposal altogether. So that's the kind of just more active involvement in the democracy that I find is so crucial at this stage, and that it not just be our friends who are Jewish or Muslim or Sikh or Hindu who are having concerns about the Christian Bible being taught in public schools, but the Christians need to explain why we have concerns about our holy text being appropriated by the government, forced on our children, including our own, in ways that impact all of our religious freedom.
I almost feel like the question I'm now going to ask you, I should have asked you 15 minutes ago, but it's because I've only just now thought about it based on something you were saying. Uh, So, those of us who are old enough remember things like the moral majority and the elder Jerry Falwell in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And my question is, the Christian nationalism that was absolutely transparent in what was happening then among Christian evangelicals, is it different? Is that different from the Christian nationalism that we're talking about today? Or is it basically the same movement and the same participants?
I think it's the same movement that has evolved, grown, and become more violent with time, right? More physically violent. So, but the core of it is the same, and that is an unquenchable thirst for power that must be gained at all costs. So, in the case of movements like Jerry Falwell's moral majority, it was a sense of being completely aligned with the Republican Party in ways that really changed, I think, the way that they interpret the gospel and what they focus on, becoming single issue, a single issue religion. It's not even a single issue voter but a single issue religion, first over limiting access to abortion and then attacking LGBTQ rights in ways that have continued to the present day. But those were politically driven aims, and aims that were completely supported by the Republican Party at the time because they were looking to solidify a reliable voting bloc. And so in making this political decision, I believe really sacrificing their pursuit of the gospel in the process. And in ways now that the term evangelical, including for many evangelicals themselves, has become less of a religious distinction and more of a political distinction in just the way that people use and associate with that term. And so we can see in real time what the impact has been on the religion, and that we see fewer and fewer young people wanting to be associated with that particular branch of Christianity, or to be honest, with Christianity at all. And so and that gets, to another aspect of this is I think some people are motivated with their quest for power of actually trying to bring people back to Christianity. This idea of, if they won't go to church on Sunday, we'll just teach them Bible stories Monday through Friday when they go to public school. I think some people really think this way, and it's like they're not gonna learn this if we don't teach it to them, and we've got to teach them where they have to be, which is going to public school. So many problems with that, including the idea that faith can't be forced, that it has to be freely chosen. But also we can look both to our past, but also to modern data that shows that any countries that have established religions, they actually see their rates of religious observance drop, right? That when the government appropriates it and forces it on other people, fewer people want to be associated with it. So their own kind of desperate attempts at self-preservation will backfire if they get their way. But the impact on the rest of us harms all of our religious freedoms in the process in ways, especially when it comes to reproductive freedoms and LGBTQ rights, in ways that are really harming the health, safety, and well-being of our neighbors, in ways that really lead us to not follow Jesus's command to love our neighbor.
Yeah. Well, Amanda Tyler, How to End Christian Nationalism. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to turn to questions from people who are watching because we have some good ones coming in. One of them, I'm going to rephrase just slightly. It's from Marianne. I'm very interested in the question she's asking. She's asking about the founding fathers. And of course, there's lots of debate about the founding fathers and what they thought about Christianity. And I think the Christian nationalist probably has an inaccurate view of, they should read some of the private writings of the founding fathers before they talk about how passionate of a Christian Thomas Jefferson was. But Marianne's comment is simply, sort of in God we trust on our currency. I mean, some of those basic things that nevertheless remained, even though the founding fathers had this very ambivalent attitude toward their Christianity. Didn't that pave the way towards some kind of a Christian nationalist idea?
Yeah, great question. I think that points to the idea that Christian nationalism is not a new problem. It's been around for a long time. I'll talk specifically about In God We Trust. It was placed in the currency during the Civil War. So much long after the founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution. And then it did not become the national motto until the 1950s. Through an act of Congress at another high tide of Christian nationalism during McCarthyism, kind of the height of the Cold War, a lot of fear about communism, and a real desire and push to Christianize American civil society and to make sure that we were labeling, as far as like who we were with, that God was on our side, and not the side, in their words, of the godless communists, right? So it was very much a concerted effort in that time. The idea of the framers' religious biographies, that is a favorite tactic of those pushing Christian nationalism and the Christian nation narrative, to really cherry pick history, to pull out quotes out of context, to try to prove that, look, these were Christians and they were deliberately trying to create a Christian nation. The problem with the cherry picking of history is it doesn't, of course, give you a full picture of the history. And rather than, I can pick out quotes to go against their quotes, but I think that also does a disservice to a fuller look at history. And so rather than do that, I just looked at the text of the US Constitution, which includes no mention of God or Christianity or Jesus. And in fact, the only place it mentions religion at all is in prohibiting religious texts for public office. So this is the clearest example I can find of an actual intent to make sure that the government and its founding document, the Constitution, remain secular and neutral towards religion, neither promoting nor denigrating it, and is the best rebuttal to America as a Christian nation. That doesn't mean that there wasn't this kind of undercurrent of Christian supremacy that was running throughout this history as well. And I think that impulse has been what has been a consistent threat to religious freedom for all people throughout our history, up to the present day. But in God we trust, I do think, so, we had it on our money, then it became the national motto. And then over the last few years, there have been bills pushed to require the posting of that in every public school in certain states. And so that is another deliberate effort to push Christian nationalism and to send a signal to public school students about who really belongs in this country, and that in order to be an American, that you have to have a particular religious belief.
Well, Carl has a similar question. Carl is asking about revisionist historians, and he mentions David Barton specifically, who I know you're familiar, with the books and the articles. And Carl's asking, how should, those of us with a broader historical understanding sort of fight back against this kind of junk history?
Yeah. So I have a whole chapter in the book about rebutting the myths of America as a Christian nation and defending the separation of church and state. So I'm very familiar with David Barton. I call him a pseudo-historian because I'm not a historian, but actual historians say that his methodology is not in line with an actual academic study of history. It is this cherry-picked version of American history. The problem is that David Barton holds a lot of power in a lot of places, and his interpretation of history is being pushed on public school students. So I think some of what I talk about, what I just said about the U.S. Constitution is one thing I think to understand. I also talk in the book about other examples of people, not just the famous letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptists explaining separation of church and state, but how other founding fathers and framers of the Constitution, even Alexis de Tocqueville, who observed America in his famous book, how they all used the language separation of church and state, that was something that, even though they didn't write or pen those words in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, that the idea was in them. I say, the words separation of powers are also not in the U.S. Constitution, but the framework is there, right? In the same way, for separation of church and state. And so I think we have to be grounded in our own understanding of constitutional history, and not, again, try to kind of go quote for quote like we're in an 18th century duel, but rather that we're kind of proposing a more complex and holistic reading of the Constitution and what's trying to be achieved. Another place that this is, and I do think it's related to understanding constitutional law, as I explained earlier, history is becoming much more front and center, and even constitutional interpretation of the First Amendment. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is not only, is this legal? Is this constitutional? Because that is changing based on this Supreme Court's interpretation, and I would say at many places, misinterpretation of First Amendment principles. But rather the question being, does this promote religious freedom for all people? Does this promote a sense of equality of belonging without regard to religion? And if it doesn't, then that isn't in line with the founding principles of the Constitution. And I think being able to frame that in a more, again, holistic way, as opposed to trying to dot every I and cross every T, I think that's that we often lose the big picture with this very narrow reading of history.
Those 18th century duels never ended very well. So
right.
I'm glad to hear that beyond that. So in the 3 minutes we have left, Amanda, why don't you give us a challenging, practical charge, assuming that everyone who is watching this now, and by the way, you can refer your friends to it on YouTube, probably as of later today or tomorrow. Give us a challenge that's very practical. What should we do?
Yeah. So that's the whole reason I wrote the book, was to help answer the question of what we should do. So in addition to reading the book, I'll give you the end first. I say in the conclusion, you're not going to end Christian nationalism by reading a book, even this one. The idea of the book is to give you practical ideas to get more engaged and involved. And I would say, find someone else in your community who is committed to doing this work, and then find another person who's committed to doing the work, and work together. This could be, if you're in a church or another house of worship, it could be someone in your community, in your religious community. It could be your neighborhood, your community group, people that you've met through working during this election period. This problem is not going to go away with this election. Take that energy that you've gathered and put it into what could we do on our local level. And I give some very practical ideas and places to go. And I want to be sure everyone knows about the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, which is at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. We have a list of everyone who has signed the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. If you don't know who's working in your community, you might find some people that you know on that list, and that could be a place to start. Or join an organizing group that's already active wherever you live. Jon, I met you when I came to Milwaukee, an event that was organized by Micah. Micah is a great example of an organizing group. So that would be a place, if you're in that area, get involved with the work of Micah. See how you can be more directly involved in supporting justice and equality in your community.
Wonderful. Well, Amanda Tyler, author of How to End Christian Nationalism, was published 9 days ago. Go buy your copy. And Amanda, I hope that the book tour continues and you reach a lot of people with this important message. And we're all going to keep trying to dismantle and create that beloved community that you're talking about.
Great. Thanks so much. It was great to be with you, Jon.
Thank you. And thank you all for being with us.